Hello, and welcome to Women Speak, a production of the Women's Resource Center in Wayne. I'm your host, Mojdeh Keykhah, and each month I will focus on a topic that will interest women and the people they care for. During this first show, we will discuss the historical context of the Women's Resource Center as seen through the eyes of Sue Stass, an early WRC volunteer and past board president, and Cheryl Brubaker, current Executive Director of the Women's Resource Center. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Well, Sue, I will dive right in with you. I was wondering what brought you to the WRC in its early days in the 70s?
In the early days in my 70s, I was newly divorced. I had 3 children. I was lucky in that I did have a steady income from my first husband, but not enough. I needed to go to work, and I was scared to death. And I found Central Baptist Church, and through Central Baptist, I learned about the center, that it was beginning, and that it was a source of information. And so I got involved. And my ticket to sanity, I always say, when I was first married, growing up after college, was to volunteer and get involved. Otherwise, if I had just stayed home, I'd have gone crazy. I didn't know that, but I just knew I had to do that. And so I really got involved in the center. But really, it started from a need, a terrible need. And the fact that we were focusing on information and giving information, which we still do, was just really answered so many of my needs at the time. So that's how I got involved. And it was a learning experience, a real learning experience.
And let's take a step back to the context of the Women's Resource Center as it was in the 70s. Why do you think it was started?
I think we were having social change. There was, people, how old was I at that point? I was late 20s, early 30s. And we had been brought up to expect to stay at home, not to work, but to be a very good mother and to take care of everything around the house. And life was changing. During the Second World War, women went to work for the first time, and there was just that social change that was starting. And for a lot of us, we didn't quite know how to handle it or what to do. It was just so different. So I think that was pretty much the social change. And it's exciting to see how much there has been, how much of a change there has been.
It's an interesting context to think about in terms of what was going on at that time. I hadn't even thought about the fact that World War II had happened, and that was
enormous.
Such a key factor. But it had to have been such conflicting messages for women then, because on one hand, there's now this need for them to go to work, but then when the men come home, do they stay at work? Do they come home?
They go home. Yes, and that was big. That was a big change, because also from the women's point of view, suddenly we discovered, we were capable, we could work. But the expectation then was to stay at home.
That's really interesting.
I think a lot of that led into the 60s.
Yeah.
And so it was quite a change.
I know when I researched some of WRC's history, when I started with WRC, it was interesting for me to put those early beginnings in context of some of the legal changes that had happened. And, so that really stood out to me. The fact that we had Title IX happening in 1972, and then one that is probably lesser known but equally impactful was the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974. So
Yes.
I talk with women who remember that when they went out to get the financing for their first home appliances, even though they had a good, steady job, they couldn't apply for it on their own without a male
They had to use their
cosigner.
husband. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
It's really interesting to think about
Terrific change. Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. So, and I think there was a lot of emotional context too, because we didn't have the self-confidence that, at least as I look at my daughters today, they have. And that's nice.
And the support. Like, I'm assuming, like you said, you were raised to take care of everything at home, to be a good mother.
That was the expectation.
Right. And then for women who find themselves in a place of having to go to work, there's got to be a lot of mixed messages there.
There were. That's definitely. And also divorce was big.
Big
And that is, I think that was important too, the support that we still give to women who are going through divorce. And that's very emotional. Even if you really want the divorce to happen, it's still very emotional. And if you have children, it's very complicated and emotional.
And that's still true today, very much.
Nothing's changed. I know that.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm so pleased that the center is
Still around.
still working. Yes, yes,
great.
because that's big.
That's good.
So when the center was founded in 1975, what did you see in the years after that as the main objective of the Women's Resource Center?
Support for the women, and we kind of followed along as needs came up, but information, and then we started getting into the legal, particularly legal help, and educational referral.
Right.
And during that process, I went to work for the Delaware County Community College, and that was the era when women were coming back to school in droves, older women, 30-year-olds, to get the education they needed to go to work. And that was a time when more women needed to work whether or not they were married. So we started doing a lot of educational. So those were the needs that we tried to address. And then in the process, we were learning how to become an organization. And that was interesting too. I mean, it's not easy.
You still had to do incorporation and getting the 501c3 status.
And learn how to work as a team.
Oh, yes.
And
be a board of directors.
be a board. Get yourself away from well, first we had to learn to have professional staff.
Oh, sure,
because
that would be a
when we
transition.
started, we didn't have professional staff. It was all volunteer.
Yeah,
So
for quite a few
it was
years, right?
Quite a change. Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
Was it advertised in the local paper originally as a group of women seeking women to help them with learning about resources in the community?
There's kind of this story, I think, in the WRC history, and I don't know how much is myth and how much is fact at this point, but there's sort of a story about an ad that was put in the local paper and calling for a meeting to talk about various issues pertaining to women, and that there was, I think, was it 35 or something? 35 women showed up at that event?
Probably, yes,
Yeah.
yes. That was early on.
That was early on.
I don't remember it
Yeah.
particularly, but yeah, it was trying to get the word out was
Part of the
problem,
work, yeah.
and a lot of it was word of mouth, and some of it was getting the women. And I was reading our history too, and I think in some ways we were a little more political then than we are now.
Interesting.
Because there was a social change. It was social change happening. And so we wanted to advertise that it was time for change.
Is it possible too, though, that by supporting women who were leaving marriages, for example, just by simply offering that support, you were making a political statement at that point in time?
We were,
yeah.
sure.
Whereas in the same way of offering that support today, it might not be the same level of political statement.
No.
Back then it was.
That's right. It was.
In similar ways as to maybe the Me Too movement would be at this time, yeah. Interesting.
And just by offering the legal resources, by offering the advice on how to pick out a major in college, where to go, how to start looking. I mean, some of that was political as well. I mean, could be seen as political.
That's true.
And so, I don't know, that's just the way we were at that point.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
So what did you think of the programs being offered at the Women's Resource Center? You mentioned the legal program. Could you describe that in a little more detail about what was being offered with legal?
Back then, not nearly as well done as it is now because we were just starting. But we did find some lawyers who would be helpful, and we would refer them when necessary.
So this was a family law program, and you found lawyers that would help ladies with issues with family
issues and so on.
Now,
But it was more, probably not as well organized as it is now. It was more
still true to the basic premise. I mean,
Yeah.
it's about getting the women in touch. I'm curious, did you have do you remember if any of the attorneys themselves were women? Because back then there may
they
not.
were men.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Whereas today, probably about half of our attorneys
them
are
would
women.
be women.
Yeah,
I know,
yeah.
my daughter's a lawyer.
That's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
You know, the
Yeah.
context.
Oh no, they were men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
And were there any other programs being offered back in the early days
You mean
You
were we
mentioned-
offering?
at the Women's Resource Center? You mentioned about
well-
career education.
I think we did do some educational, and that was a little bit advertising, I guess, for the community college, but we also brought other local colleges in. And so we had a program or two on that. And but a lot of it was telephone, you know.
A lot of people
Some
calling on
things
the
never
phone.
change. And we had a list of who to call, where to go, as well as,
The resources.
yeah. And then we did start the, somewhere, I don't know when, we did start the single moms program. I mean, place for mothers to get together and
Yeah.
trade ideas. And we would have people come in and talk.
That's good.
And that was important. But that was later.
So going back a little bit, you mentioned somewhat of your reasons for getting involved with WRC, and what led you to become board president?
I haven't a clue. I think there wasn't really anyone else. and I've always been
You were the one
kind
who,
of a bossy woman, so I really think that's probably
You were one
what
of those
happened.
bossy girls.
Yes,
Huh?
yes.
That was great. That was great.
So,
And in the 80s, when you were chair of the board, how many people were on the board in those days?
I was trying to remember, and I'd say 5 to 7, somewhere in there. And
A pretty tight crew, I would say.
it was a small group. It was hard to get people involved, and also, in the history we talk about how the 80s was such a time of transition, and we did. We went from the small group who was starting this, and all of a sudden we were growing, and we had to learn how to grow. And we didn't have any, most of us had no history of doing that. So it was definitely trial and error. And rather contentious at times, and you know, it was not easy, but we worked on it.
I was going to say that's inherent in change and growth, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. While the Women's Resource Center was started as an outgrowth of women from the Central Baptist Church, it's now an independent organization.
Yes.
And did that come as a specific time in history, or was that just always the case?
I think it was always the case. The women who, you know, I wasn't involved at the very beginning. I came in a little later. And it was already independent then. Mm-hmm. And I know that when I first started my journey, I hadn't been particularly involved in a church, and I was looking for help. And how I ended up at Central Baptist, when I lived way out in Phoenixville, I do not know. I can't remember. But they were a very forward-looking congregation at that point. Mm-hmm. And it worked very well for me. And as I can recall, the Women's Resource Center was always independent. Mm-hmm. And we had the space, which you still have. Now, we only had the first floor to start with, but that's all we needed.
Yeah.
And the Baptist Church was always a support, but they kept their hands off.
They respected the autonomy of the organization.
Really did. They really
That's
did.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Fantastic.
And I say that's very consistent with the relationship still today.
I'm so glad. Yeah.
It's very consistent.
It was very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to just watch, to hear you talk about where it started, and you can really see a lot of the core elements still in place today,
Yes.
even with the growth and change, you know, that it's still, you know, we still have that volunteer-based helpline, 20 volunteers coming in every week.
Yes, and when I stop in, like today, there were 3 volunteers there working away.
Yeah, so even though we've added a few staff along the way, we still have retained that very community-based element, which is
I think, very important.
And when you talk about responding to the needs, that's always fascinating to me too, because we have the helpline. Mm-hmm. We get a lot of information about the shifting needs of women, so what women are calling about. So it really helps you continue to be relevant. Yeah. Fortunately, now we have a lot more women attorneys along with the men attorneys, you know, but we still can...
a lot of, I bet, more legal questions than we had.
Maybe so, or maybe some different legal questions along the way.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah. So, good.
Yeah.
So what did you see as some of the challenges to the sustaining of the Women's Resource Center through its 45-year history while you were there?
While I was there, I was only the first 10 or so. It was, part of it was money, and part of it was building a team, and not just the board, but a team of all the volunteers, so that we all were kind of on the same page. Part of it was figuring out what our mission was. I mean, we knew it was to help women. We knew it was to help them by giving them information and eventually referring them to sources of information, whether it was legal or something else. But it was just trying to figure out what our mission was, and then how to sell it to
donors.
to donors.
Yeah.
And I don't know when our art project started.
Oh, that's a fascinating...
That was really terrific.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it started in my time. It may have started right afterwards.
I was going to say, definitely in the 80s.
Yes, I think that was after I was, not really as involved anymore. But that was terrific because it did bring us money, but it also gave such a resource to women who needed it at that point.
You should describe that a little bit for Mojdeh. What do you?
It was, I still have a couple of pictures and I gave some back to the center, but we started to have an art show for women artists.
Yeah.
And we had it here in Wayne, not at the center. We found someplace else that was a better exhibit area. And it was social, but it was also business in that we wanted to sell it. We got a cut, but the women got most of the money, but we got some. And we got the publicity, and it gave us a lot of publicity because the show was very good and the art was good, and people came. And sure, probably the first show was mostly women came, but then more and more people started to come, not just women. And it was very successful. And then, after a while, it wasn't needed anymore, which was good too.
Quite a few years.
Yeah, it did. It went on, I don't know how long, 8, 10 years, something like that.
That is fantastic. So it really established a tradition in the community. The name got out there.
Yeah, it helped us a lot.
And it was probably one of our very first fundraisers that we held.
Yeah,
that was community-wide.
Exactly. So, I can't, it's terrible. I cannot remember who initiated it.
Oh, I don't know that I've ever heard that.
It wasn't me because I wasn't artistic, but somebody
within the group
did, and it was
well, maybe
great.
they'll hear this conversation and come forward.
I hope so. I think it would be wonderful. Yeah.
So moving gears to today, what do you see as some of the key changes in women's lives today compared with when you were growing up?
Sometimes I chuckle talking to my daughter and I say, some things haven't changed. However, there are just so many more opportunities for women, need for education, and again, as we look at our social context today, well-educated women, which means they have had some support as children along the way. Somehow they've been able to pay for their education. They have incredible opportunities, which they didn't have. Now, whether they're getting paid the same, I'm not so sure. And we can get into that. But the other thing is we have a social chain, a social division in this country, and a lot of it is around money. And some of it is around background, whether it's Hispanic, Black, or whatever. And so we have a long way to go. And that's really about all I can say.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was making that observation to Mojdeh the other day that we often use the stat when we talk about pay equity among men and women. We use the stat of, women make 80 cents to the dollar. Well, that is white women to white men. If you look at the comparison of Latina women to white men, for example, it's more like 65 cents on the dollar. Exactly. So, and I think one of our challenges at WRC is to make sure that we are supporting and advancing the cause for all women, for everyone who identifies.
And to me, that speaks to education.
Yeah.
Because more than anything, and right now, the cost of education, the opportunities for education are so scattered, and yet 90% of good paying jobs require some kind of education.
Right.
And I think that's critical. And of course, the fact that I worked for a community college for 25 years may have something to do with
May bias you towards education.
Yes.
That's probably not a bad bias. So.
I don't think so.
What do you think of young women today going into the STEM fields, the science, technology fields?
I think it's great. I mean, I hated algebra, frankly, so forget it for me, but I think it's great. Yeah.
I have a daughter who is more of your kind of STEM kind of kid, and so it's been really interesting to watch, and there's all this encouragement for girls to be in the STEM field, which is fantastic. However, I was just talking with Mojdeh about this earlier today, the mentors or the people judging their science fair projects
are men.
And so are they aware of what that means and how to support those young women as they're moving forward? So
Yeah. So young women are still being pioneers, is what you're saying.
Yes,
Sure.
they still are,
Sure.
because we're saying you can be or do anything you want to be, and they're believing us. We have to make sure then that the path is supported the rest of the way. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't know about, I only have one granddaughter. It's amazing. And I don't know where exactly she's going to go. It'll be interesting to watch. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Speaking of education, you mentioned this story earlier today to me about give a person a fish, they eat for a day, but teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime. And did you mention that it was somehow the motto of the WRC as well?
I guess my husband introduced that, and I think it did take off a little bit.
The idea that you're giving people information and resources that they can take and use long term.
Yes,
That makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Makes a lot of sense.
It does. And I guess it kind of helped that our family vacation revolves around fishing.
So it's a very relevant metaphor for your family.
Relevant metaphor, yes. But it was an important and one that both my husband and I worked hard with our children, all of our children, to learn how to fish.
Learn how to fish in life as otherwise.
So if women and men would like to learn more about the Women's Resource Center, how can they get in contact or go online to do that?
So our website is womensresourcecenter.net. So they can go on there and see the different programs and services. Our helpline is 610-687-6391, or they can again, visit the website. We have a contact where they can email us and let them know the resources they're looking for, and we'll connect them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming here today and speaking with us about the historical context of the Women's Resource Center.
Glad to do it.
Thank you, viewers, for watching Women Speak. I look forward to bringing you more in-depth conversations on women's issues. Until next time,